Okay, it looks like we're live on Infinite Regress YouTube channel. And here with me, I have Juggling Lessons and Harry, and we are going to talk about morality. So we've been reading this book by Steven Pinker called, what is it called? The Blank Slate.
The Blank Slate.
The Modern Denial of Human Nature. And so Harry, what have you recently read in the book that has given you thoughts about how you see the issue of morality?
Well, so specifically, I don't actually think me and Pinker agree on moral realism. At least that's what I get from some of the subtext of the book. I don't know for sure whether he's been more explicit in his perspectives, but there is a bit in the book where he talks about how we define objective categories, how we define something as a science, or whether something is subjective or not, basically. And I thought it was actually a really good defense for the idea that morality could be couched within some kind of objective realm. And basically he was saying, look, there are these categories of things which are like money and presidents and things like that, which are created by human beings. But you could be objectively right or wrong within that subjective category. And then he says there are things about the physical world, like the atomic number of cadmium, for instance, which is kind of a thing about the physical world that you'll learn. And if society was to collapse, you'd reinvent science again, you'd come back to that particular realization. And I suppose for me, I felt that was just like with Sean Carroll's poetic naturalism, where he talks about how we define scientific categories and how we go about dividing the world and towards more objective categories and more subjective, and an emergence level between those different topics. I thought that this was another way of kind of trying to cash out how morality could be objective and how it's actually different from that subjective objective topic like money. So it's subjective that we've created up the topic of money, but objective that you could be wrong about the facts within that topic that we set up. But I think that morality could be couched in more of the physical world terms, like the atomic number of cadmium. And it's much more related to biology, or could be much more related to biology. It could mean, if we decide to define it, as changes in conscious state. And we could set up parameters in which you're moving within changes within conscious states, and could define certain types of conscious state relative to others. So that, for me, that is where kind of the Sam Harris idea comes in, where we have a moral landscape of these different conscious states, and moving between one point or the other is objective, which I don't think we disagree on. But what we disagree on,
I think so. Now, when we're talking about these conscious states, how does saying conscious states give us a gradient, a preference in one direction or another through the morality choice space?
So you have to accept, in order for that to be the case, that there are preferable conscious states and there are less preferable conscious states.
Okay, so entering into a preferable conscious state is the thing. So now preferable. What how do we choose that? Because I think that is if we're saying that there is an objectively preferable, how do we show that in the world?
Right. So I suppose preferred conscious states will depend on your biological makeup and your particular consciousness and what's happening to you in that time. So it'll depend on a number of biological factors. For instance, how your nervous system is set up and the different environmental variables around you. And so I think for me, it just seems to be an essence of consciousness, just being a conscious being in this world, that I always have a preference about what's happening around me. And there are always more desired states and less desired states. I don't know whether a conscious realm exists, and maybe it does, where preference is not like there's some kind of consciousness where there's nothing preferable within it. I don't know whether that's the case. But within the consciousness that we experience as humans, it seems like those states are a fact.
Okay, may I have an example of something that's on one side of the line and something that's on the other side of the line?
Yeah,
and maybe something that's uncertain, somewhere in the gray. But the other two would be enough to give me a direction of the gradient.
Yeah, sure. So I think pain would feature quite a lot within this in terms of deciding direction. So I could come up with numerous scenarios where people would be in less pain or more pain. And I think when we're talking about morality, if we define it in terms of changes in conscious state over a group versus an individual, there'll be trickier cases where we have to try and figure out how the group dynamics versus kind of the individual freedoms. And so those would probably be the more gray areas. I would say that there might be a plurality of answers within those particular scenarios. So this is kind of the freedom and collective payoff that you might find in terms of trying to think about what might be the best states for people to experience, the best societies, the people people to be within. So I think those would be the grayest scenarios. And I think the most cut and dry scenarios would be like putting someone's hand on a burning stove or not putting someone's hand on a burning stove.
Sure. I mean, this comes down to individual values. I'm thinking of the opening of Conan. What is best in life? To vanquish your enemies and hear the lamentations of thy women. That's not my value. And I think that's the dicing question as to what is the preferred state, because whatever I value is what I'm going to put the gradient on.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I see where you.
Yeah.
I see
I've got a friend who's really, really into the freedom thing, and masks piss her off really bad.
Yes. Yeah.
So because for her, freedom is way more important than several other things.
Yeah. So I think within, I only know of a pop culture version of Haidt's research. I've never actually read it in its true science peer-reviewed form. But my understanding, the pop culture version of Haidt's ideas is that we will have a range of different subjective moral states, what we think are right and wrong, what turns on our disgust levels, what makes us feel kind and open. And so people will have different preferences. I would say this is beyond that. This is basically a claim to say that there are preferential states for people within mankind and with it as a human being. And you could be wrong about which states cause you to be happy. So it is not mind dependent in the sense that, I have an opinion that my values work. You have an opinion that your values work. I could find out, for instance, that the value of eating 15 cheeseburgers a night, and I think that that's the best thing for me to do. I could find out that that's not actually the case, and that
I could predict several downsides. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think that I'm going to avoid using the philosophical jargon, but just to the point. I think the moral claims are claims about the natural world. So when we say something is good for us, we are making an empirical statement, basically saying that if I do this, it will improve my conscious state, and therefore they are testable by science.
So let me see if I can dice that a little bit. I want to agree that it is objectively possible within a given model to have examples of definitely the right move. In chess, if you put me in check and I only have one move to get out of check, that is objectively the right move to make. And at that point, I don't have any other choices.
Yeah.
So within the model of chess, I have objective strategy. Some cases. If we have a model of morality, which probably starts with a goal, and I don't know of a model of morality besides God said it, and here's a goal or a series of goals to try to balance, or values. I don't know of any others. If there are others, I'd like to hear about them. So then it becomes a question about goals. What's the model? What's the goal? And within that, I can say, if the model can have objective reality, and if the goal is really an important one in the world, I will grant objective moral values if we can agree on the goal is survival, or the goal is some balance of values, any of those. Now, I think I can also claim subjectivity on the choice of goal.
Okay. So for me, I think I get what you're saying. How do you think about the idea of health in terms of it being a goal-orientated science, in terms of improving health? Would you consider that to be an objective science? Would you say that fits into this kind of subjective, objective category?
I think there are definite examples of things that are bad for your health and things that are good for your health in the model of health. No problem. I think health is closely related to survival, thriving, closely aligned, not perfectly.
Yeah.
And And so then I'm talking all next about whose health. Where's my in group? Where's my out group? And health doesn't help me discern an in group out group value.
Okay.
Because if it's strictly my own health, there can only be one Highlander stuff. That's a lot different than the kind of morality that I know that you hold and that I hold and that Mark holds.
Right. So I get what you're saying, and morality, I think, is different than health. There is something fun. It's a different biological phenomenon, although I'd say that the two are interconnected.
Sure.
I would say that when it comes to, but put it this way, we would lose the rules of chess if mankind got wiped
Sure,
off.
Of course.
Right.
It wouldn't be It wouldn't come up this next way. It would have 10 squares by 10, and there'd be three queens because they're poly or something. Right.
This is where I think the distinction is important here, because you would still rediscover that there are better conscious states and worse conscious states. So the idea of morality applying to, it's basically saying how conscious states change in a given biological organism, and it makes the assumption that there are preferential conscious states based on that organism's biology.
Okay.
And that biological interaction with the environment, of course, so like epigenetics and all that kind of jazz. So it's saying that even if we were to lose all of mankind, we could rediscover the facts again about preferential conscious states.
Yes. Yeah, it would become very obvious that being afraid of death and avoiding death is better for survival and longevity. That would be like, we'd almost never lose that.
Right. So this is where I draw a slight. So I think this is just where you cut it, right? Is where you consider something objective, subjective, and maybe it's like
it is a definition of objective versus subjective. Sure. Yeah.
And maybe the important conversation is not. There are very different ways to have this conversation.
Yeah.
And it may be not so important about where we draw the line. What may be important is whether we can investigate it as an idea in terms of using science, or whether we can discover that we could be right or wrong about this, whether people think they can be right or wrong about any given value about society.
Yes.
And also whether it's worthwhile a pursuit in the first place, as a science. And for me, understanding which conscious states are preferential and how to reach them is by definition worthwhile, because that's all we ever care about as conscious beings. Because we are conscious. We care about consciousness because we are conscious.
Do you derive your InOut Group inclusions, exclusions from this, or do you have another value that drives your boundary of in group, out group?
I don't know how to cash out what should be my in group or out group. I suspect that there is some kind of like Pareto optimum where I have, whether it's Dunbar's number or some kind of number which dictates how much should be in my in group, how much should be in my out group, based on my own biology,
like
and based on
a ratio, like a population ratio.
So if you talk about in group and out group in terms of who should I include within who I consider my close circle and who I should consider outside of that circle.
But it's the outside is like enemy or available to be exploited. A lot of people would say dehumanized.
Okay, yeah. So I think
like I've spoken to racists recently who want to not grant similar rights to anybody that doesn't follow their physical look or something.
Okay,
they want them to get out of that country. So their in group is defined by a racial definition that's in their head,
right?
And they're using that as a. I'm going too far in. And then there are folks that say including humanity isn't enough. We have to include sentient animals.
Right. Yeah. So I would say that within the purview of like, let's say, a coin new science of morality based on preferential conscious experience, good being towards more preferential states. I would say that it should be able to tell us something about how we should treat others, and it should tell us something about compassion, because that directly connects to our conscious experience, how we are compassionate towards others and who is compassionate towards us. So I'd say that we could, I think it's discoverable. I think it's an claim to say that, for instance, our in-group should be based around skin color. And the assumption being that that's better for me and that's better for kind of group stability in my preferential conscious experience.
Yeah, the first rule of recruitability is you have to include yourself in the in-group in a way that's unmistakable.
And so within that, we could then investigate whether that claim. So I think that claim connects to the natural world. I think it could be investigated. So people who say that we should, for instance, exclude according to race, because that will make a better society and better preferential conscious states. That is an explorable question by science. So for me, I don't mind so much that it has, some people would call it subjective objective, in the sense of we get the goals from our subjectivity and then explore how our biology reacts to that particular thing. I'd say, number one, it's more connected than, let's say, chess on money, because conscious states are a kind of a biological phenomenon. So it's something that we could rediscover this science about how conscious states change according to environment and biology, and how our preferences shift over time. And I would also say that it is an important science to have, because it directly relates to how we're feeling and how we live within the world.
Okay.
And
do you see it? Sorry, go ahead.
No,
more thought?
No.
Do you see this objectivity as graspable? Is there a way to recruit a lot of people to it, to say, yes, here's a value. Maybe it's well-being, maybe it's pain-based, maybe it's some you call it a there was a word for it. You were just saying where you take multiple values and you figure out the balance between them.
Pareto optimum.
Pareto optimum, yeah. So Pareto optimum of these things. Can we get people to agree to those? What those values would be? If so, we could say objective within that selection, and I think you get no argument from the folks like myself. How do we recruit to a particular one? What's the downside if we get the wrong set?
Yeah. Okay. So I see it again like health. So if you were to say to me, how do we recruit people to this concept of health, of kind of improving our so on and so forth? And I would say that although that is definitely an important concern, but it's not the prime concern when they're in this first stage of deciding whether or not it's a worthwhile science. Because whether I can convince people about learning the atomic number of cadmium or not is
right,
but it's still part of the physical world, and so it still can be investigated. I think that we could, as a side note, I do think we could convince people that this is a particular value, because I think that just like how we form scientific categories, so go back, I don't know, 2,000 years, whatever it may be, people have different ideas what chemistry meant and what biology meant, and there were different things that fall within that scientific purview. So chemistry may have meant fire, water, air, and
alchemy.
And exactly. So it may have meant some of those different things, and we've arrived at a definition. That is a subjective definition about the natural world, but it's a subjective definition that's useful because it cuts up the natural world into a neat little block that we can explore. So we're talking about
it makes future testable predictions and it's reliable. I say it's objective.
Yeah. And so for me, that's where this kind of sits, is that we are deciding on this definition, and how we decide on the definitions is an important question to ask. I think that we decide on definitions based on how it correlates with the natural world, whether it seems to comport with something that makes sense, and whether it is something that we can investigate. And it does all those things, and it's useful. I think that actually, honestly, most of the time, it's just about usability.
Sure. You're going to end with a utilitarian argument because there's a whole bunch of people. That's the only one they're going to accept.
Right. So the utility of dividing the world into, so we divide biology, physics, chemistry like that, but because it has a utility in investigating phenomenon at those different scales and defining what we're doing at those particular scales. And I would say that conscious experience fits within that kind of, we are investigating conscious experience, and so it has a similar flavor to other scientific topics, probably more so like something like health, which is a bit more has a bit more ambiguity around it, and has some set goals in mind to begin with.
Yeah, I think the health one to me seems more obvious. I can look at some morbidity and mortality, and perhaps some other sorts of self-satisfaction. Maybe I don't know. There's a bunch of different ways that I can measure health, and they all kind of add up together. But the conscious states, better conscious states, that's really vague for me. That's a lot less vague than health.
Right. So I think, so if you want to think about how the science would work, we still got several of those. So the overlap between health and conscious states, I think, is obviously vast, because health relates to biology and biology relates to conscious states. So if you're
Sure.
So if you have a bad diet, then you're less likely to have there are peaks within that landscape, borrowing from Sam Harris's moral landscape. There are peaks within that landscape which are reachable when you have good health. So you may experience a better life if you were to exercise more and clean up your diet a bit. And so in my mind, that it's very similar. So we could use a whole load of different metrics to try and understand people's health and where they are, and almost an infinite number of metrics, because there are so many different ways in which we could slice and dice people's health. And similarly, within conscious states, it's incredibly complex to try and describe or understand people's conscious states. Some people would say it's impossible, a hard problem, but there is some correlates within what we could measure that seem to relate to our conscious states. Like, for instance, blood work. So we know that if people or brain activity, or even at the lowest level, it would fit into the world of psychology, basically, and how people's mindsets change over time according to different environmental and biological variables.
I have a question though, about trying to relate, trying to deal with the health issue and also the morality issue together. Let's say you have two people who, one of whom decides he's going to exercise more, clean up his diet, because he believes he'll be happier if he's healthier. And he believes the exercise and the improved diet is a route to being healthier and therefore happier. But the other guy, he knows that that exercising more and cleaning up his diet would improve his health. He doesn't disagree on that factual claim, but he really enjoys watching television or playing PlayStation. And he doesn't want, and he really enjoys those potato chips and the junk food that he really gets a lot of pleasure out of that. So he makes a different calculation. He decides to, for whatever reason, he decides not to exercise and clean up his diet. Can we say one is right and one is wrong? Not from a health perspective, because they both agree that from a health perspective, the first guy's right. But can we actually say that one of these people is wrong from a moral perspective?
So I would say that we could. So we could look. I mean, it would be about an individual. It wouldn't be a particularly strong moral statement. I'd say that we could gather the evidence to see whether we could or not. So we're investigating basically how a single individual, how their acts change their happiness levels. And again, happiness is another incredibly broad term, of course. And we could do a thing like we could enroll that person on a diet and change his habits and then compare how he feels later on compared to how he felt in the past, for instance. That would give us some information about whether he's doing something right or wrong in terms of morality. I'd say that morality is both individual and extends beyond the individual. So I could do things that are bad for myself and I could do things that are good for myself. So it makes sense to talk in terms of those terms. I realize there's a bit of a tongue twist to say in terms of those terms, but it makes sense for me to talk about morality according to my own, how it affects myself as well as how it affects others. So I could be bad for myself, for instance. And so I think it does make sense to say that person is bad. There is, of course, I think that science doesn't actually add certainty, but actually does the opposite and actually makes people couch terms in ways that are far more uncertain. So we'd say, for instance, that within the populations that we've explored and the sample sizes that we have, we've discovered that people on average who exercise more seem to score happier on this particular happiness survey. So the term would come out something like that. It wouldn't say this person is right or wrong. And so I understand that there is a worry, and there should be an enormous worry when it comes to people with moral certainty, because that's when people can act in incredibly harmful ways. I would say that would be captured by the system, because we would then find that moral certainty leads to unhappiness, and therefore it's something.
Does moral certainty lead to unhappiness?
Well, that's a question, right? I think that'd be an interesting hypothesis to explore.
Sure.
I'd be tempted to say yes. In fact, you know Camille, who's been on Pine Creek's YouTube channel quite a bit. I think I caught him once saying somewhere, I forget where he said, societies that believed in moral realism turned out to be more oppressive than societies that rejected moral realism. Now, I wanted to follow up with him. I'm like, how do we know this? How do we know which societies believed in
religion
moral realism?
believes in moral realism, and religion has been the dominant aspect over the last 2,000, 3,000 years, something like that. So, I mean, what's the control group?
Yeah, that's a good question. He's not on this podcast, so we won't be able to ask him. But anyway,
I was shocked to hear. So I don't know whether you realize whether you guys picked up on this, but Pinker says that Hitler wasn't an atheist, but actually a Roman Catholic. And I know that that's a debated thing, because often he's brought up as an example when you introduce. I would say that those kind of political systems, so socialism in that particular context, is a perfect example of kind of moral certainty causing terrible consequences. And it's based on lots of assumptions about what will make a good society. So basically what he's doing is, with little to no scientific evidence, he's saying this is what will make society better, and he goes ahead and does it. Adding science into that would mean that we would use the scientific method to investigate what actually makes people happier, and that would also include a broad study of things like history and psychology. So it would be a very wishy-washy subject. It would be something, because again, we're trying to it's an emergent level there that is built up from physics, chemistry, and then it's kind of at the top of biology, and it will connect to psychology, it'll connect to health, it'll connect to economics, and basically social sciences. So it would be a very broad topic, and I think we basically talk about this colloquially anyway. And science cuts it up in different ways already. It assumes those values. When you're justifying grants, you justify it actually in terms of improving humanity. That's basically where a lot of the public science money goes. So I think we already have a lot of these values. It's just saying that. Pursuit of these values in a scientific term, I don't think actually increases certainty. I think it would increase humbleness and increase uncertainty, and actually make us coin terms, kind of coin statements in a much more scientific way, which is say that in this particular circumstances, using this particular method, we have discovered with 90% with a 90% confidence interval that this is the case. So it would stop us saying, you're wrong, he's right. I think it would actually encourage us to discuss the topic a bit more. And if people disagreed, then they might come up with different methods. I think it would actually improve the discourse rather than solidify it and then lead to, and I don't know, I'm then speculating, but then lead to, I don't think it would lead to like social Darwinism or the other policies. I think it would actually retract those. That would be my opinion.
I'd like to try to paraphrase Mark's original question. In his example, happiness was the goal. And in his first sub-example, he agreed that health was the way to get to the happiness. And in the second example, he was uncertain that health was the way to get to the happiness, that the things that were against the health in a couple of cases might have been more conducive to happiness. Is he incorrect to now? And then you said he probably was incorrect, but and then you argued that it's because health does lead to happiness. What about the other condition, that the addiction, the unhealthy habit, indeed actually benefits that individual more in happiness? Is he wrong to pursue it?
That's a great question. I think that it'd be one of those things that we'd want to explore and understand how getting rid of that addiction, how that changes that person's personality and how that changes that person's quality of life. And so there may be, like with all things, maybe there's an upfront cost to losing that addiction. And maybe that addiction is actually necessary for that person to cope with psychological trauma in their past. And so in order it depends on how they go about getting rid of that addiction. I think that would be a question it's a scientific, I still see that as a scientific question, basically,
Sure.
because we've set up the terms and and it's terms about the natural world. And we've got, so far, the scientific method is the best way to explore the natural world.
Well, I just thought of something. What about, let's take two cases, two situations where, okay, in one case you have a health minister of a country that decides to mandate, I mean mandate with fines, if you don't comply, 30 minutes of exercise per day, and also mandates or prohibits certain junk foods, unhealthy foods.
Mm.
Okay, because based on the belief that this will improve people's health, and by improving people's health, it will improve the aggregate amount of happiness in society. But then you have another situation, another society where the leader of the society says, we all young girls must have their genitals mutilated because that's what God wants. And we must obey God's laws because that will increase the happiness of society to adhere to God's laws. Now, I imagine we probably both intuitively reject both ideas. One strong, maybe one, the latter one, in more vigorously than the first one. But why? Why do we think that it's bad for one society or one health minister to force people to exercise and force people to abstain from junk food? And why do we also think it's wrong for this theocrat to force young girls to have their genitals mutilated?
Yeah. So I think that just because I subjectively think it's wrong, and in both of those examples, one more than another I find particularly repellent, doesn't necessarily mean that I'm wrong in terms of the morality I'm talking about. So I have a pretty strong intuition that, for instance, removing the clitoris from women when they're children is a terrible act and is immoral. However, that is my subjective opinion. And within this objective morality, we want to compare societies which have that particular act and compare societies which don't have that particular act, try and control for the variables as best we could, and see the different outcomes in terms of people's liveliness and happiness. Because it could be that however disgusted I am with that act, we actually discover that it liberates those women in a different sexual way or makes them feel differently, and therefore it makes them live better lives. I don't think that's the case. That's not my subjective opinion. But opening up to a science would mean that it would be my personal preference that that's the case, but then we'd want to explore it. And similarly with the other one, which is basically about it's a freedom. It's basically stepping on people's personal freedom and liberty. And so far, what little I understand about politics and economics is that people like to have that freedom, and as soon as you take away that freedom, they feel worse within that particular society. To some extent, depends on the degree of the freedoms taken away. So both of those are claims that which basically would be put forward as hypotheses, and we both have our subjective opinions about this, Juggling and myself. But we could both be wrong unless, it's only our subjective opinion until we can bring evidence to the table, and then it suggests something more deeply about the kind of the human condition and what's right.
So I'd like to go back to a question from a while back. What happens if we get the value set wrong?
Right. So
obviously we were giving examples of really bad value sets that cause horrible things.
Yes. Yeah. Can you? I don't think I really understand the question. So do you mind unpacking?
Okay. So I'm going to pretend that Mark prefers happiness and you prefer health as the value.
Yeah. Okay,
now, if you think that one leads to the other, if you both agree one leads to the other, then you're aligned. And in the degrees where you don't think one leads to the other, you're misaligned.
Right.
What happens if one or the other of you get the police? When a priesthood gets the police, that's when it gets really bad.
So, I almost think that question doesn't make sense in terms of the way that I'm couching it. So there's some ground level work that I've done here. So there's some assumptions I've made, basically, maybe some circular reasoning. But the idea is that there is a preferential state to reach, and there might be a plurality of different ways to reach those preferential states within consciousness. So the different tools and methods we can use to reach the same outcome and same preferential state. But nonetheless, there will be right ways to do this, and there will be wrong ways to do this. Or there'll be, but I'll use clearer terms, there'll be false ways to get to those states, and there will be true ways to get to those particular states. And if Mark prefers a particular state over the other, or if actually the calculus we're doing, it's so fine-grained and difficult to realize, I think that there is a kind of a plateau. There's kind of a place that we can reach where Mark might have one value that's slightly different than the other, but actually it doesn't change much whether his values are slightly different in terms of, he values health a little bit more, or I value, for instance, short-term pleasure a little bit more. And actually, no matter the way you change, you could turn those knobs a little bit more, and it doesn't seem to change my happiness that much, doesn't seem to change my well-being that much.
So what if I bring a complete curveball and say the most important thing that I'm concerned about is job security?
Right.
Your health only leads to better job security, and therefore, maybe I'm really against immigration because I don't want you to send my factories to another country. I want to make sure the other countries never get technologically superior because I'm afraid my factory is going to go to China, and I'm not going to go with it.
Yeah, so it could be that your preferential states are going to be partly based on your subjective opinion about what's right and wrong. And that opinion is based within biology. And again, from my understanding of pop psychology, it changes from person to person and typically changes across the political spectrum, where we'd value one thing over the other thing. Okay. It would be fine for us to conclude that those people who have those particular values and live, and therefore, if they got a choice, could live in a society which holds those values stronger, would be a happier person. And similarly, if we were to separate the people out according to their, I'm not saying this should be done by any stretch, but I'm saying that we could claim, for instance, we could hypothesize that if we separate the people out who have different kind of moral intuitions and put them into different societies, those societies actually would be happier because they'd agree on things more often, and we'd meet those values quicker. I'd say it still comes into terms of preferential conscious states. So I could be wrong I could say that I value job security above everything else. And actually, if you make that value, you could be pushing yourself into a worse state consciously in terms of your well-being. You could actually be harming yourself and the people around you needlessly.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I see a lot of problems when you take a value like that and turn it up to 11. A lot of bad things happen that are ruinous to the person, even exercising it. Yeah. And I think that we need societies that, so I get a moral fact that I would maybe trot out is that as a society that accepts a wide range of views, a wide range of moral dispositions, and then has a discussion to determine what might be more preferential, is a society that's better than one that dictates that this particular value set should be taken above everything else and force it to be the case. So kind of that heterodox academy approach, where it allows different political opinions in order for those political opinions to be explored and for you to come at some kind of Pareto optimum for that particular group, and also to just introduce different types of thinking and different value sets, which might lead to different and more interesting answers, more helpful answers, maybe.
Is meta-ethics, you think meta-ethics is sort of a waste of time in a way? I mean, the reason why I ask this is I feel like the three of us are roughly in agreement. I'm sure we have disagreements about some particular issues, public policy issues, but I think we all kind of say that, I think the reason why we would disagree is we might say, well, I don't think that your set of public policy positions will lead us towards maximum happiness and minimized pain and suffering. And that's the ground on which we would probably disagree. But it seems like I'm going to guess that all three of us think that, we should pursue public policies and even pursue behavior in our individual lives that maximize happiness and pleasure and minimize pain and suffering. And, and maybe there's some other features in there as well. But so in that, and whether we want to call that objective or subjective, or if we want to say that morality is real or illusory or simply something that's going on in our brains, regardless, it seems like we're going to be pursuing the same goal, which is, abstract goal of maximizing happiness, minimizing pain and suffering. Am I right about that? Do we agree on that? That's what the goal ought to be.
Yeah. So I think that the whole point of my position, and I'm definitely misusing terms that would be used differently in philosophical literature, and the way that we're defining some of these terms, I think, will grind with some people. I think that my whole perspective is basically to say that if someone says that this is good, and I say, no, this is good, is this just an opinion that can never be resolved through empirical study? His opinion or her opinion and my opinion, can we resolve between the two using science? And for me, we can. So someone could have a subjective opinion about what's right and wrong, and they themselves could be wrong about that opinion. So that it could be true, or it could be a true or false statement. It's not true just because they believe it. Okay.
When you're using the terms good, was that best? This is not best because this other is best, because they might both be good.
Right. So I'm also, I realize that just through my comment, like I often use right and wrong to mean true and false, whereas when so I can be extra confusing in this particular circumstance.
I'm okay with it. I'm listening generously.
Good. I'm glad. I love a good faith discussion. So I would say that I'm using in those terms. So we could define good however we want, right? So you could define good like maximizing job security, and I could define good as something else. And we can use that as a starting point. You're still making a claim about the natural world, because you're making a claim about conscious states, about how people experience things, and about particular liberties of individuals.
Yeah, it's which thing I hold to be the most important value on which I want to fulcrum my choices.
Right. And the meta-ethical discussion is about what those values should actually be. So there's a step beyond this, is that how do we determine which values should we take forward and investigate, or what should the science determine in terms of, so if we've already agreed what's good and bad, which is kind of then beyond meta-ethics.
Then it's just accounting. It's accounting, statistics, actuarial tables.
Yeah. There you go. And so first of all, I don't actually think that's as obvious as we're making it out to be. I think that people still think.
I agree.
And so I don't think that's a small point to I think it's quite big that we agree on the fact that I could be wrong about something. I could be wrong about a moral claim, even though we share the same morality. Okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I could be definitely wrong that the best objective move in a chess position was this. Totally.
Right. But our problem is saying that who's to say that those values are something that we should pick, right? Who's to say that we have?
Yeah, that's the fulcrum of objective subjective that the argument keeps floating around on.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And so in my mind, I'm saying that it comes down again to defining morality. So how should we define morality as a subject to explore, and how should we define the terms good or bad? Because once we've made those definitions, then like you said, it's just accounting. Okay.
Yep.
And so that's where the philosophy enters, and that's what this whole discussion is about. I know I keep repeating this, but I think it's sometimes important to just refocus what the discussion is about. And in my mind, a sensible and useful way of defining it is in terms of preferential conscious states. You don't have to define it that way, just like you don't have to define chemistry as molecules. You could define it as investigating fire, air, and water. But I think that it serves utility. It connects to the natural world in a real way that could be investigated scientifically. And there's enormous use to us investigating the world in that way. And moreover, I'd say that it is probably it would be one of the most useful sciences, or is one of the most useful things to explore empirically, because all we care about is our conscious experience. We can't care about anything else. If we're not conscious, then we don't care about anything. There's nothing to care about.
Well, there are those. I mean, I guess we've probably all run into some deeply religious believers who, if you were to tell them that we should base our morality, that what is moral and what is immoral relates to what improves happiness, increases pleasure versus, and minimize suffering and pain. If you were to present that to some very deeply religious people, they might say, no, if you're going to do something that increases the amount of pleasure and pain or pleasure and happiness that people enjoy, but it offends God, then you ought not do it.
Yeah.
In other words, they have a different yardstick and a different reference point. So I guess that's where the meta-ethical discussion comes in. Whereas, and I think what you're saying, Harry, is there's still a lot of debate. It still takes some work to get people to agree that happiness and pleasure on the one hand and pain and suffering on the other should be the real yardsticks by which we measure, by which we determine what is moral and what is not. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think theist moral realists do not agree with atheist moral realists.
Yeah.
So I think those are two very distinct moral realisms.
But
one of them is trying to say that there's something fundamental that is, maybe we see it emergent in evolutionary societies or something, and that's how we can detect that it's there, maybe. But that is fundamental about nature. And then, of course, the theist is saying, because my God said so, and that makes it objective, which I see as subjective to their God, but that's me quibbling detail.
Yes. So I would say that I would agree. So if a God does exist and he can condemn us to hell, then my type of moral realism, or defining morality in terms of preferential conscious states, would incorporate that, because we're saying that's now part of the natural world that we've discovered. And so it's probably really important that we make sure we get ourselves into heaven, because eternity is a bloody long time. And so therefore we want to shift all our things towards making sure we avoid getting into hell. So that's where I think that kind of this type of moral realism, a secular moral realism, if you want, is far more robust, because it's based on what we observe and what we understand ourselves, which is that certain biological creatures seem to have conscious states, and these states determine whether they feel good or bad.
Okay. Suffering. Is that a close enough word to harm and pain and things that is that a good enough word?
I think so. I think that we use that enough in terms of again. So who's to say that suffering is bad? Might be a question that someone puts forward. I'd say that, there you go. So I'd say that we have to agree on definitions first, right? So that's the first thing that comes to. And I know it's a meta discussion, so it's like, how do we then decide that those definitions are right? Right, so we agree on the definitions of words if they comport to reality in the same way, if they make sense of reality in some way. So they describe a phenomenon that we can observe, touch, and feel, or whatever, or maybe not, just a thought. So so it connects to our state in some particular way, and it allows us to communicate. That's how we use language. That's how we define words. That's how we come up with different lexicons. And so in my head, the way that we use suffering is by definition just like a bachelor is an unmarried man. And you say, well, who's to say that a bachelor is an unmarried man? And what if I define it differently? And I would say, well, you could say that. I don't think that makes sense. I don't think we could create a different noise for that to mean something differently. But when we're having these discussions, we've got to have the base definition set out. And I would say that if whatever word you want to use, the word I'm looking for should describe those horrible conscious states, those states that we want to avoid. So if you don't agree with suffering, then I'm happy to call it whatever you want to call it. But
I'm happy. I'm happy to establish the word suffering. I've had a discussion similar to this in the last few weeks, where somebody was saying suffering is the value that we should look at when in our moral. That should be the primary avoidance of suffering, or avoidance of causing of suffering.
Yeah.
And then I said, so what's the opposite term? And specifically, I'm talking about the term where if I bore an animal, or I had a pet, and they only ever had suffering, and they didn't have anything that made the suffering worthwhile, that would be really bad. If I had a pet that neither had any suffering nor whatever this other term would be, that would probably not be great. But if they had a little bit of suffering and a lot of the other thing, we're probably 2 thumbs up. So what do we call that other thing? the thing that makes suffering worthwhile.
Yeah. I think we should have words for that, and we should have ideas about, there are certain things that will mean that we will suffer. So the way I would say, I wouldn't even call that, or maybe I would call that suffering. It depends. I suppose it depends on, again, on a little bit of our definitions, how we go about doing that. And I think there's
I'm
a
okay
really,
if we shift from suffering to another term, and it still comes to the same question: what's the opposite that makes it worthwhile?
right.
What's the thing
right.
I can add in that makes that reduction, that negative, offset?
Well, often it's reaching a different preferential conscious state, right? It's reaching a different place. So, I go to the gym and it hurts to work out, but actually in the long term, that makes me feel great and actually improves my well-being and my happiness. And it makes me flourish. And so there are states of suffering which are necessary for our future selves and for the people around us. I don't know. Maybe there is some kind of term to say that, often it's codified in stories or ideas rather than a specific term. I don't know whether different languages actually have a term for this. I'd be interested to know.
Go ahead, Mark. Did you? No. In my prior conversation, we ended up with the term fulfillment.
That's nice.
That suffering was offset by fulfillment, and I didn't want to throw that in because I wanted to see if there was a better word before I defined one.
Yeah, I like that.
And that is a better word, because if you're just focusing on suffering, then the way to minimize suffering would be to have everybody drink the Kool-Aid and die, and then there's no suffering. But fulfillment implies that there's a really, even if there is still some suffering in the world, you still want to stay alive and try to improve.
You could use the Greek term eudaimonia, like they can reach in that state where it contains a certain amount of resilience to it. It's not saying that chaos won't enter your life and you won't feel awful, you won't have to do awful things, but it's saying that you have a certain resilience and outlook that makes the best of things and makes you feel good.
Was that hedonia?
Eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia. I'll look it up later. Eudaimonia.
Yeah, I'll just double check again that I've actually said something that's true. So they say here, eudaimonia, sometimes anglicized as they say it in different ways there, is a Greek word commonly translated as happiness or welfare. However, human flourishing or prosperity and blessedness have been proposed as more accurate translations. There you go.
So would reaching for something like that in the positive, trying to maximize something like that, be as valid as minimizing suffering? If I had to choose one or the other, or maybe it's the balance between the two, trying to always make sure that one overwhelms the other.
I think going towards eudaimonia is actually a slightly more complex and maybe a slightly more nuanced approach, because it incorporates this idea that suffering may be necessary at some time. So I think they're saying, and that's often why we say unnecessary suffering, is because there are times when it is necessary. So they say that
murder is unjustified killing. Yeah,
right.
It's one of those, make the definition include the exception.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I don't think I have any further questions.
Well, I just thought of something that I'd like to toss out there. I think this is more. This really doesn't have much to do with meta ethics, but it's something I thought of, which is, because I think Juggling mentioned, or maybe it was Harry that mentioned addiction as something that impacts various people throughout their lives, and for example, I've read about people who've had their lives destroyed by gambling addiction, for example, and it made me. Even though I tend to think that gambling ought to be legal, when I've read about stories about people who've had their lives destroyed by the gambling addiction, I've kind of hesitated a little bit on that. I'm also, like most people, I do not think that alcohol should be banned. I personally don't drink alcohol because I'm sort of have a mild allergy to it, but I don't think it should be banned. But then, when I was on Facebook a while ago and I saw a sister of a friend of mine who was hit by a drunk driver when she was 19 years old, and she's been in a wheelchair ever since. And I read her story on Facebook. I had to kind of recheck my belief that alcohol should be legal. So what do you think about issues like that, where the human beings, the nature of human beings, to steal from Steven Pinker. Given that we we can be impaired by certain experiences, gambling or alcohol, what have you. Should that be factored into how we regulate those activities?
We already do, right? We already know that there's a cost for that particular liberty. I would say that colloquially, we already act as if everyone agrees that there are preferential states for people to be in, and therefore we're trying to do this kind of constant cost benefit analysis when it comes to law and social norms. Like, I would say that already happens. And I would say that a good way of investigating whether alcohol is good for society is comparing different societies that maybe don't have alcohol as legal, or have a higher or compare teetotalers to people who do drink, and their kind of their health outcomes and how they feel. And so I think there are ways of investigating that. I think I would say it's an empirical claim to say whether alcohol legalization is good or bad for society. And kind of implicit within that is saying that there are better places for society to be based on people's consciousness.
Okay. So let me ask this. If I had a product that, if people used it regularly, 1 in 1,000 of them would die per year from the direct use of the product, would that be a reason to ban it?
Oh, I don't know. know.
That would probably be a reason to be really sketchy about it if you had something like that.
So. Yeah.
Now, maybe there's a different number where if I used a product, a random other person would die. 1 in 100,000 people, 1 in 100,000 users will cause the death of a random other person.
I think
1 in 100,000. Is that worth banning it?
I think it depends on the utility of the product. First of all, I think we make we make those things all the time. So driving would be, I think, an excellent example.
Oh yeah.
So
the actual number in my quick math, is 1 in 20,000 people in the U.S. are killed each year by drunk drivers. It's about the square root of our population. It's roughly the square root of 400 million. I think is 20,000. If I'm doing that quick math correctly. No, that's not quite right. Nevertheless,
I can't do that math. Also, you were in the low 300 millions, or maybe I don't know.
I think we're about 360, 370. So I was rounding to 400, but in very round, fluffy numbers, it seems like if we lose 20,000 people a year, it's about a 1 in 20,000 chance you're going to die of drunk driving, of being hit by a drunk driver in the U.S.
320,000
fatalities a year from it.
For your
pardon?
For your knowledge, there, Juggling, 328 million.
Oh, I was way high. Okay, good. Thank you for that update. 328. Yeah.
So I think all the time, basically, I would say, and there are certain risks that this is something to be explored and to be understood and to be discussed.
Yeah.
And maybe
obviously cigarette smoking is 500,000 people a year. Much higher numbers.
This is the thing, right? So but there will be better ways of doing this than not, right? So there might be a plateau which we can't discern whether this product is good if we remove it or not. But there are definitely edges to that plateau that fall very, very quickly, where it's like, you don't have to wear a seatbelt if you don't want to, or you can. And in the past, obviously, that was the case. And then after fighting, I think quite a lot of legal
seatbelt and helmet laws, you can tell who cares about freedom the most.
And in our chat, we have Thin Box Dictator. He's posted 2 things. One of them is that he says Schopenhauer was right. Wouldn't you say? Life without pain has no meaning.
Oh, okay, sure.
And then he says, gentlemen, I wish to give your lives meaning. But his most recent post was, when you have illegal alcohol, people will still brew it themselves, possibly the wrong way.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah. So, how many blind people from just a little wood alcohol in the process? Very bad. Very bad.
Yeah. Also, I think Schopenhauer was a miserable git. I don't deny that pain was important, but he didn't have any friends. He only kept poodles for company and could barely, function as a social human. So I don't know whether he should be handing out life advice. But I would say that there is a certain way to cut things. There is wisdom, right? We know that there is philosophical wisdom out there. Well, that's what philosophy is, right? Exploring those wide terms. And wisdom is about kind of, often I find that good philosophy or practical philosophy is about promoting that eudaimonia that we talked about, those preferential states, or however you want to put it forward. And we all experience within life things like grief and pain and suffering and loss. And wisdom is saying, okay, well, how do we tackle this? How do we tackle the idea of impermanence or things like that? And so there is a gauntlet to be run within those particular scenarios, and how you go about rising to those challenges will basically affect how happy you are and your resilience to life in general.
I don't know if your morals are real, but I like them, so I'm good with it.
And I'm tempted on that note to end our live stream. Although if you guys have anything else to bring up, I'm willing to go on.
No, I'm good.
Okay, well, hey, thank you guys both for joining me on this great discussion, and we will post this in our Discord server. See you later.
See you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.